Every Christmas, we're told this is the safest time of the year, but in some real places, something comes back when the night gets quiet. A train that never arrived, a prison where the singing never stopped, and a hospital where children still appear. These are Christmas horror stories they don't tell you about. I first heard the story on December 23rd, the night before Christmas Eve, sitting in a diner off Route 60 inches, Hinton, West Virginia. A real railroad town folded deep into the New River Gorge, the kind of place where tracks cut through backyards and the sound of freight trains becomes part of childhood memory. The waitress was refilling my coffee when an old man at the counter leaned over and asked why I was taking pictures of the abandoned rail bridge down by the river. I told him the truth, that my father had worked the rail lines here in the early 1992s, and that after he died, I'd been trying to piece together the last places he'd been before he quit the job suddenly and never spoke about it again. The man stared at me for a long moment, then said, "If you're here for the bridge, don't be there tomorrow night." And when I asked why, he just replied, "Because that train still runs on Christmas Eve." The thing about Appalachia is that legends don't feel like stories people tell for fun. They feel like warnings that never found the right language. My father, Daniel Rowe, had been a freight conductor for CSX, following routes that overlapped with some of the oldest rail lines in the eastern United States lines, built in the late 1800s to haul coal and timber out of the mountains. One of those was the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, the C&O, which passed straight through Hinton. The town itself exists because of that railroad. In 1907, when Hinton was incorporated, the rail yards were already one of the busiest hubs in the region. There are records of derailments, labor disputes, even a documented boiler explosion in 1910 that killed several workers, all preserved in local archives. What isn't in the records is the event people here talk about quietly. A Christmas Eve train in 1917 that left the yard and never officially arrived at its destination. According to local folklore, the train was a short passenger run, carrying railroad families and workers heading home for Christmas. The official story says it was canceled due to mechanical issues, but a handwritten log from the Hinton Rail Office, dated the 24th of December, 1917, lists the departure time and crew names. That log exists. I saw it myself later at the Summers County Historical Society. What doesn't exist is an arrival record. No wreck was reported. No debris was ever found. The line itself was later partially dismantled after a reroute in the 1,930 seconds, leaving sections of track abandoned and swallowed by forest. That's where the legend begins, and it's also where my father's story ends. My father used to hum Christmas carols under his breath when he worked around the house. After he left the railroad, he stopped. He stopped celebrating Christmas altogether, actually. No tree, no lights. When I asked him why when I was a kid, he told me Christmas was for people who didn't hear what he heard. I didn't understand that until years later, after his death, when I found a small cassette tape in a box labeled Work Notes. The tape was dated the 24th of December 1992. On it was the faint sound of wind, the rhythmic clatter of something metallic, and my father's voice, low and strained, saying, "That line's been dead for decades, so why can I hear it?" That tape brought me to Hinton. I checked into a motel overlooking the river, the same river that once carried coal barges alongside the trains. On the afternoon of December 24th, I walked the abandoned section of track just east of town, where the rails end abruptly beneath a canopy of bare winter trees. The air smelled like damp leaves and rust. Every few steps, old wooden ties jutted up at odd angles, as if the ground itself had tried to spit them out. I noticed something strange then. The gravel between the rails was cleaner than the surrounding ground, as if it had been disturbed recently, despite no trains running there in decades. As dusk settled, the temperature dropped fast. The mountains pressed in on all sides, turning the sky into a narrow strip of fading light. I told myself I'd leave before dark, but curiosity has a way of dulling common sense. I thought about my father, about how he'd been around my age when he quit, how he'd started drinking after that Christmas, how he'd wake up some nights convinced he'd missed a signal. When full darkness came, it came completely. The forest went quiet in that unnatural way that makes your ears strain for sound. That's when I felt it first, not heard, but felt a vibration under my boots, subtle but unmistakable, like distant thunder traveling through steel. At 8:47 p.m., the exact time listed in the 1917 logbook, I heard a train horn. It came from deep in the gorge, long and low, echoing off the rock walls. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Freight lines still run on the opposite side of the river. Sound carries strangely in the mountains. But this horn was wrong. It was closer, and it was coming from the dead line beneath my feet. The vibration grew stronger. The gravel began to tremble, pebbles clicking together like teeth. The air filled with the metallic scent of ozone and cold iron. I stepped back from the tracks just as a headlight bloomed in the darkness ahead. Not blindingly bright like modern locomotives, but dim and yellow, like an old carbide lamp. The shape that emerged was unmistakably a steam engine, black and hulking. Its surfaces slick, as if wet despite the freezing air. I could hear it clearly now, the chuff of pistons, the hiss of steam, the clatter of wheels on rails that should not exist. Behind it were passenger cars, their windows glowing faintly. I could see silhouettes inside. People, sitting still, facing forward. The train slowed as it approached me, though it never fully stopped. As it passed, I felt a wave of cold so intense it burned. The faces in the windows were pale, indistinct, but one of them turned toward me. Even through the glass and the darkness, I recognized him. My father looked exactly as he had in his early 40s. The age he was when he quit the railroad. His eyes were wide, his mouth moving soundlessly, his hand raised as if to warn me back. The last car was a caboose, red paint peeling, lantern swinging from its rear platform. Painted on its side was a number I later confirmed matched a C&O caboose listed as decommissioned in 1920. As it disappeared into the darkness beyond the broken track, the vibration faded, the sound dissolved, and the forest returned to its unnatural silence. I stood there shaking, my breath coming out in white clouds, the smell of coal smoke lingering in the air long after the train was gone. I don't remember walking back to town, but I remember sitting in my car, staring at my hands on the steering wheel, convinced that if I turned the key, I'd hear the horn again. I drove back to the motel and didn't sleep. At dawn, I went straight to the Historical Society. The archivist, a woman who'd lived in Hinton her whole life, listened quietly as I described what I'd seen. When I finished, she pulled out a folder without saying a word. Inside were copies of old newspaper clippings and a photograph I'd never seen. It showed a group of railroad workers standing in front of a steam engine, dated December 1917. One of the men in the photo was identified by name: Daniel Rowe, my father's grandfather. The archivist told me the story she'd been told as a child, that the Christmas Eve train in 1917 had carried workers home early because of rumors of a strike and fears of sabotage during wartime. That something went wrong in the gorge, that the company quietly covered it up to avoid panic, and that ever since, the train returns every Christmas Eve, running the same route, carrying those who never made it home. Sometimes, she said, it picks up new passengers, people who hear it, who follow the sound too closely, who mistake nostalgia for safety. I left Hinton that afternoon. I haven't been back since. Every Christmas Eve now, at exactly 8:47 p.m., I hear a distant horn, no matter where I am. It comes through walls, through headphones, through sleep. I understand now why my father stopped celebrating, why he drank, why he recorded that tape. He wasn't haunted by the past, he was marked by it. The train never arrived because it's still running. And once it lets you hear it, it never really lets you go. The first time I heard about the Christmas ghosts of Alcatraz, it wasn't from a tour guide or a late-night podcast, but from my Uncle Michael, a man who never embellished a story in his life, the kind of person who corrected you if you exaggerated the weather. He worked as a night security contractor for the National Park Service in the early 2000s, long after Alcatraz had closed as a federal prison and reopened as a historical site. And he told me, very plainly, that Christmas Eve was the only night he refused to work alone on the island. He didn't say it like a warning or a challenge. He said it like a fact. I didn't understand what he meant until years later, after he died, when I found his old notebook in a box labeled Seasonal Logs, and on the page dated December 24th, written in block letters, were the words, "They sing when the bay is quiet." That line stayed with me, and it's what brought me to San Francisco in December, carrying a recorder, a notebook, and a personal reason I didn't tell anyone about. Alcatraz Island is a real place with a documented history so heavy it feels like it presses down on your chest when you step onto it. Before it was a prison, it was a military fort. Before that, it was used as a military prison during the Civil War. From 1934 to 1963, it held some of the most notorious inmates in the United States: Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, Robert Stroud. What most people don't focus on is that Alcatraz was designed to be psychologically punishing. You could hear the city at night. You could see the lights of San Francisco, hear laughter carried over the water, music drifting across the bay. On Christmas Eve, according to prison records, inmates were sometimes allowed small privileges: a special meal, a movie, music in the mess hall. There are official photographs from the late 1930s showing inmates seated in rows, wearing paper hats, a decorated tree behind them. That part is real. What isn't in the official brochures is the incident recorded in a guard's log on December 24th, 1937, noting inmate disturbance in D block during night hours, followed by a hastily written addendum, screaming continued despite isolation. My motivation for being there was simple, at least on the surface. I'm a sound engineer by trade, specializing in acoustic environments, and I had convinced myself that the stories about Alcatraz were just that stories born from echoing corridors, cold stone, and human imagination. The deeper reason was my father. He had been incarcerated briefly in the late 1952 for a crime he never talked about. And though he was never sent to Alcatraz, he told me once, when I was a kid, that he'd rather die than spend Christmas on that island. He said it with a seriousness that scared me more than the words themselves. After he passed, I wanted to understand why. I arrived on Alcatraz on December 23rd as part of a special after-hours access program arranged through a colleague. The ferry ride over was short, but the bay felt endless. The water dark and restless. The island rose out of the fog like a concrete bruise. During the day, Alcatraz is crowded with tourists, but at night, especially in winter, it empties completely. The wind becomes the loudest thing. The buildings creak as temperatures drop. Metal railings hum softly, as if remembering the hands that once gripped them. My equipment picked up a constant low-frequency sound I couldn't immediately identify. Something between wind and vibration, present everywhere on the island. By Christmas Eve, I had settled into a routine, setting up microphones in different cell blocks, recording ambient noise, documenting temperature changes, making notes about how sound traveled through the corridors. That evening, just after sunset, the bay went unusually calm. The wind died down, and with it, the background noise I'd grown used to. It felt like someone had turned down the volume on the world. I remembered my uncle's note. When the bay is quiet, at around 8:30 p.m., I was in D Block, the disciplinary wing known as the Hole, where inmates were kept in near total isolation. Historically, D Block is associated with the 1937 incident involving an inmate whose name appears redacted in later records. According to surviving documentation, the inmate was placed in a dark cell after exhibiting erratic behavior, claiming he was being watched. That night, guards reported hearing him scream for hours, describing a presence in the cell with glowing eyes. By morning, the inmate was found dead. The cause officially listed as exposure, though some guards privately questioned how a man could freeze to death indoors. That part isn't in the official reports, but it's repeated in multiple first-hand accounts recorded decades later. Standing there in the dark, I felt a pressure change, like my ears popping before a storm. My recorder picked up a faint sound, rhythmic and distant. At first, I thought it was the city music from San Francisco drifting across the water, but it was wrong. The rhythm was slow, deliberate. It took me a few seconds to recognize it as singing. Not loud, not clear, but unmistakably human voices layered together. Christmas carols, off-key, slowed down, as if remembered rather than sung. The sound didn't come from any single direction. It seemed to fill the space, bouncing off the concrete, coming from the walls themselves. I followed it down the corridor, my footsteps sounding too loud in the sudden quiet. The temperature dropped noticeably, my breath visible in the beam of my flashlight. I passed cell after cell, each one empty, each one feeling watched. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The sound wasn't getting louder as I moved closer. It stayed the same volume, as if it were following me instead of the other way around. In the mess hall, where Christmas meals had once been served, the singing grew clearer. I could make out fragments of words, silent, holy, night, but stretched thin, distorted. I set my equipment down, hands shaking, and checked the levels. The recorder was picking it up. This wasn't in my head. As I adjusted the microphone, I heard something else underneath the singing. The faint clink of metal, like utensils on trays, and the low murmur of men talking, dozens of voices overlapping. I smelled something then, sharp and unexpected. Coffee. Hot coffee. It didn't make sense. There was nothing on the island that could produce that smell. A memory surfaced uninvited. My father at the kitchen table on Christmas morning, staring into his mug, distant. He used to say coffee tasted different on Christmas, bitter and sweet at the same time. I felt that same contradiction settle in my chest as the lights in the mess hall flickered once and went steady again. I knew, intellectually, that the electrical system on Alcatraz is old and prone to issues. But the timing felt intentional, like punctuation. The singing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse. In it, I heard footsteps. Not echoes of my own, but slow, measured steps moving along the upper tier. I shined my light upward and caught a glimpse of movement. Shadows passing behind the bars of cells that hadn't held inmates in over half a century. I told myself it was my light, my angle, my imagination. Then a voice spoke, close to my ear, low and hoarse. "You can hear it too." I spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. No one was there. My heart hammered so hard I thought I might pass out. The recorder spiked, capturing a burst of static and something else, a breath that wasn't mine. I backed out of the mess hall, every instinct screaming at me to leave the island immediately. But another part of me, the part that had come here for answers, refused to run. I thought of my uncle, of my father, of all the men who had spent Christmas on this rock surrounded by freedom they could see but never touch. Near the end of the main cell house, I saw a light. A soft, yellow glow coming from a single cell. That shouldn't have been possible. I approached slowly, each step heavy. Inside the cell, I saw a man sitting on the bunk, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. He looked solid, real, dressed in an old-style prison uniform. I recognized him instantly, not because I'd seen his face before, but because I knew him. It was my father, younger than I ever remembered him, but unmistakably him. He looked up when he sensed me, eyes tired, sad, and said, "It's loud tonight." I don't remember speaking, but I remember understanding. This wasn't a ghost, in the traditional sense. It was an echo, a residue of emotion and memory bound to a place designed to break men quietly. Christmas, with its promise of warmth and belonging, had amplified that residue year after year. The cell went dark. The smell of coffee faded. The bay outside remained unnaturally still. I left Alcatraz before dawn on Christmas Day. The ferry ride back felt longer than the trip out. When I checked my recordings later, most of them were static and ambient noise, nothing remarkable. One file, time-stamped December 24th at 9:02 p.m., contained faint singing beneath the wind, followed by a man's voice whispering, "Don't listen too long." I still hear it every Christmas Eve, no matter where I am. The bay doesn't have to be quiet anymore. Once you've heard the Christmas ghosts of Alcatraz, silence is never really silent again. The first time I heard children laughing at Waverly Hills was on Christmas Eve, and what unsettled me wasn't the sound itself, but how completely wrong it felt against the silence of the hill. Waverly Hills Sanatorium sits above Louisville, Kentucky, in the small community of Fairdale. A real place with a real history that refuses to stay buried. Built in 1910 as a two-story hospital, and expanded in 1926 into the massive Gothic structure people recognize today. It became infamous as a tuberculosis sanatorium during the early 20th century. Thousands died there, and that number isn't exaggerated folklore. It's supported by death records, city archives, and the infamous body chute known as the death tunnel, used to discreetly remove corpses so living patients wouldn't lose hope. I knew all of this before I ever set foot on the property. I told myself I was prepared. What I wasn't prepared for was how personal the place would become to me. My younger sister, Emily, died of cystic fibrosis when she was 8. She spent long stretches of her short life in hospitals, and some of my earliest memories are of sitting in sterile hallways during the holidays, listening to distant Christmas music echo through fluorescent corridors. After she died, my mother couldn't stand Christmas anymore. Decorations went into boxes and never came back out. I grew up associating the season not with warmth, but with waiting rooms, quiet sobs, and the unbearable sound of children coughing behind thin walls. Years later, when I became a freelance videographer specializing in historical documentaries, Waverly Hills felt like a place I could approach objectively, clinically, as if distance and time had drained it of anything that could hurt me. I was wrong. I arrived at Waverly Hills on December 24th as part of a small overnight investigation group. These events are legal and documented. The sanatorium operates tours and paranormal investigations year-round. The guide gave us the usual warnings and historical overview, mentioning documented phenomena, doors opening on their own, cold spots, unexplained voices, and frequent reports of child apparitions, especially around the former pediatric ward. She also mentioned, almost casually, that Christmas Eve was active. That word stuck with me. Active like a machine, active like a wound that hadn't closed. The building loomed against the winter sky, its broken windows dark and watchful. As we stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply. The smell was a mix of damp concrete, dust, and something faintly medicinal, like alcohol wipes left too long in open air. Our footsteps echoed down corridors that once held rows of beds, coughing patients, and nurses moving quickly to avoid breathing in what they were trying to cure. Historically, children were treated here too, separated from adults in designated areas. Records from the 1,920 confirm pediatric TB wards existed, though details about outcomes are sparse. Children, especially, were vulnerable, and many never left. By 9 p.m., the group had spread out across different floors. I focused my camera on ambient shots, peeling paint, rusted bed frames, wheelchairs abandoned mid-motion. Around 9:30, while filming near the third-floor nurse's station, I heard it. A soft giggle, high-pitched and brief, like a child trying not to be heard. I froze. Someone behind me whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, relief washing over me that I hadn't imagined it. But when I turned, no one was there. The hallway behind me was empty. The giggle came again, followed by the faint sound of footsteps running, bare feet slapping lightly against tile. The sound moved away from me, toward the pediatric wing. Every rational explanation ran through my head. Other investigators, acoustics, wind, but none of them fit. The sound was too close, too deliberate. I followed it, my camera light cutting a narrow path through the darkness. The air grew colder with every step, and my breath began to fog the lens. As I entered the pediatric ward, the atmosphere shifted. The walls were decorated with faded murals, cartoon animals peeling from the plaster. It felt wrong, like a memory frozen in place. My equipment began to malfunction, battery draining rapidly, audio levels spiking and dropping without reason. That's when I noticed the balls. Small rubber balls, old-fashioned, scuffed and dull, rolling slowly across the floor as if nudged by unseen hands. One came to rest against my boot. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. A Christmas carol drifted through the hall, barely audible. Away in a manger. It sounded like it was being hummed, not sung. The melody broken and incomplete. Historically, Waverly Hills staff did try to make holidays feel normal. Archived photos show Christmas trees in wards. Nurses dressed as Santa Claus, small gifts for patients. The idea was to keep spirits up, standing there, listening to that broken tune. I wondered how many children had clung to those moments, believing they would go home soon. The humming stopped abruptly. In its place came coughing. Dry, rattling coughs, echoing from multiple rooms at once. I felt a pressure in my chest, a phantom tightness that made it hard to breathe. My camera light flickered, and for a split second, I saw movement at the end of the hall. A small figure stood there, no more than 6 or 7 years old, wearing what looked like a hospital gown. I couldn't see the face clearly, just the outline, the way the head tilted slightly, as if curious. Emily? The name slipped out before I could stop it. I hated myself for saying it, for projecting my grief onto whatever this was. The figure didn't respond, but another appeared beside it. Then another, 3, 4, small silhouettes lining the hallway, silent now, watching. The temperature plummeted. My fingers went numb around the camera. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. A memory hit me hard. My sister, sitting in her hospital bed on Christmas Eve, surrounded by paper snowflakes taped to the walls, asking me if Santa knew where the hospital was. I'd told her yes, I'd lied. The figures began to move, not toward me, but past me, their forms blurring as they went. As they passed, I felt a rush of cold, and something else, sadness so heavy it made my vision blur. One brushed my arm, and the sensation was like touching ice wrapped in cloth. The last child stopped directly in front of me. For a moment, the hallway lights flickered on, bathing the space in a sickly yellow glow. I saw the child's face then. It wasn't Emily. It was no one I knew, and that somehow made it worse. The eyes were too old for the face, filled with exhaustion and resignation. The child opened its mouth, and instead of words, I heard my own voice, recorded years ago on a home video, reading a Christmas story at Emily's bedside. The lights went out. The hallway was empty. The balls lay scattered across the floor, unmoving. My camera shut off completely. I stood there, shaking until distant voices from the other investigators broke the spell. They found me sitting against the wall, unable to explain what I'd seen. Later, back in the staging area, others shared their experiences. One woman claimed she'd seen handprints appear on a fogged window. Another heard a child ask, "Can we go home now?" These stories weren't new. They echoed reports logged by staff and visitors for decades, especially around Christmas. I left Waverly Hills just after midnight. As I walked down the hill, I looked back at the building one last time. In one of the third-floor windows, I thought I saw a line of small figures standing together, watching. The moment I blinked, they were gone. Weeks later, reviewing my footage, I found something I couldn't explain. At 10:17 p.m., in the pediatric wing, the audio picked up clear children's laughter layered over coughing. followed by a distinct phrase whispered in unison. It's Christmas. No editing artifacts. No interference. Just that. Every Christmas Eve since. My chest tightens at the sound of distant laughter. I don't decorate. I don't celebrate. I remember Waverly Hills, the children who never left, and the way grief doesn't disappear, it waits. And sometimes, when the world grows quiet enough, it remembers how to play. Most people think Christmas is about going home, but some places don't let you leave. They remember you. And once they do, every Christmas sounds a little different.